Hi, and welcome to this session on NetBox custom scripts and plugins. My name is John Anderson. I'm a principal consultant at Network to Code, and I'm also a NetBox maintainer. And this session is really going to be about how we can take two very specific extensibility features from NetBox and use them to integrate NetBox into our existing ecosystem within our organization. So it's really about taking NetBox and fitting it to our existing tools, processes, and so forth, and also building our actual automation framework and ecosystem around NetBox. So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time in this session to go into an overview of what NetBox is, but I've got one slide here just for folks that have perhaps seen or heard of NetBox before but aren't entirely sure of what we're going to be doing here today. So NetBox is, of course, an open source DCIM and IPAM platform primarily. It seeks to model the physical network that we have. So we model things like devices, racks, sites, and regions, and so forth. We track utilization of components and assignment of prefixes, IP addresses, and so forth. We also have support for tracking virtual machines and their related infrastructure items. We do things like circuits and tenants and configuration context data and a ton of more stuff. And unfortunately, like I mentioned, we don't really have time to go into all of that today, but if you are interested in a more generic overview of what NetBox is, I do invite you to check out Jeremy Stretch's session here at Interop entitled An Introduction to Source of Truth and NetBox that will go into much more detail about what NetBox is in general and what it can do for you. Here we see the many extensibility options that NetBox offers. And what we're illustrating in this slide is that as we go from left to right across these features, there's an increased demand in development skill set that's necessary to make effective use of these features. Now keep in mind, the more advanced feature does offer more potential to an organization that wishes to use that feature. Now don't get scared away either, because I truly do feel that the learning curve of that development skill set is in line with the natural learning curve that comes with network automation. Now unfortunately in this session, we don't have time to go into all of these great features, and we'll be focusing on what it takes to get started with custom scripts and plugins. So let's get started. Beginning with custom scripts, these are effectively Python scripts that will be executed within NetBox. What this means is that we have repeatable business logic that's being exposed to the users of your NetBox instance. So these are web form-based scripts, but it is important to note that they can also be executed from NetBox's REST API. So in general, what we're doing here is we're performing generic actions. You as the author get to define through the code that you write what each script actually does. So you could read and manipulate data within the NetBox instance, or you could potentially integrate with an external system. It's up to you. Now, the user is going to get to see the status report of a script when it executes, and you as the author can optionally return data back to the user as well. It could be in a CSV format or whatever you choose. Now, to me, custom scripts are a great way to consolidate all of the ancillary automation tooling and infrastructure that we wind up building when we get started with network automation. So this is all the glue code, all of the scripts that we write that just kind of sit on a box somewhere that don't have a really great place to live. So we can take all of that business logic and we can put it in NetBox so that our users have one place, a one-stop shop to go and execute common functions. To expand on that last point, let's consider that on the left-hand side, this might look like a lot of people's current approach to network automation, in that your networking teams want to automate some of their day-to-day tasks. So they're creating their own scripts and tooling to be able to execute things locally. And that's fine, we want these teams to be able to do automation like this. But the issue is there are some downfalls and some general overhead that come with this type of approach. Version control is a big one that comes to mind. So if one team member writes a script and wants to share that with another team member, we want to make sure that they're using the same version of that script. And also environment differences between two people's workstations is a really big factor, especially with Python. And if there's specialized infrastructure for executing those scripts, that's another big consideration. So what NetBox can do in this type of situation is allow you to take that custom business logic from that ancillary tooling and scripting and move it into NetBox custom scripts and put those custom scripts into NetBox so that your users have this functionality exposed to them in one place where they don't have to worry about those environments or versioning between team members and so forth. But enough talking about this, let's get into some hands-on with custom scripts now. Alright, so let's take a look at custom scripts in NetBox. That's going to be under the Other tab, and we'll go down to Scripts, and we can see we have one script here called New Branch. And the idea here is we're going to provide some common input, and we're going to create a new site in NetBox with a set of devices specified by the number that we provide here and the manufacturer and model, which corresponds to the device type in NetBox. So the concept here is perhaps we're a retail organization, so all of our branch sites wind up looking identical to one another. So let's create our NYC branch here that'll have 3 devices, and these will be Juniper 2200Cs. And this commit changes down here is a feature of custom scripts itself. This allows us to do a dry run to see what the script would do without actually making modifications to the data in NetBox. In this case, we will want those changes to actually be made. We'll run the script. It runs and comes back and tells us it was successful and created these 3 devices. So if we come over to sites, we have a new site NYC in a planned state with 3 devices in it, those 3 devices here. So let's take a look at the actual code. This is the actual custom script itself, the actual Python code that does exactly what we just saw. So here we see we have a class of script, and then there's some metadata that we have to provide here, namely the name and description. And then the next section are the variables that we want in the script. So you saw in that form, when we actually entered the data, these are the elements of the script that actually define that input from the user. And we can support string input types and numeric input types, booleans, and so forth. And I'll call out here the object var. This is how we actually select existing data within NetBox. So I had my list of device types there. That's where I selected the Juniper 2200C. That's how we did that. Then the run method is the meat of the actual script itself. This is the business logic that we implement with the code. So we're going to create first the site object, and then for each of the devices that we specified in the range, i.e. the number of devices that we wanted, that count, we're going to create a new device, save it, and log a successful message. That's how we get the output from the script there with those log messages. And then we also had output where we're outputting the actual data in a CSV format. And then we just run through and print that out and then return that data. And that is the essence of a custom script there. That's all that's really to it. So what if we wanted to do something a little bit more complicated? This example here was dealing with existing data in NetBox. Let's say we wanted to talk to an external system. So the example for that I have for you today is with Snipe IT. So this is a system that is a generic inventory or asset tracking system. So the concept here is that a system like this would track physical assets in your organization outside of just the networking domain. So in this case, this particular Snipe IT deals with all sorts of IT related assets. So let's imagine a use case where maybe your procurement department is purchasing devices. They'll populate that data in this sort of system, and then we want to sync that data to NetBox. So when they create the new entities that have been purchased for a given switch or router, we want to import that automatically into NetBox. Well, we could do that with a custom script here on maybe a per site basis. So here we've got 2 devices here, an MX80 and a 3650 that have been purchased for a location called CHS. So this would correspond to a site CHS in our NetBox instance. So let's create a custom script that will actually allow us to import the entities here from Snipe IT into our actual NetBox instance. So let's create a new script here. So we'll call this our Snipe IT import. And this is a Python file. And then I have gone ahead and prepared this script for us already, but we'll take a look at what it's actually doing here. So I've got a base path here because this is the API endpoint base path to our actual Snipe IT instance. And then, like we saw before, we've got some metadata here in our script that defines the name and the description, and then we've got some input. In this case, just one field that we need the user to select, which is the name of the site that we want to import data into. And then we get into the meat of our actual run method, which again is the actual business logic of the script here. And what we're going to do, we come down here after just some setup up there, is we're going to make a call to Snipe IT to get the location object. That would be that CHS location entity. And then once we have that, we can go to the hardware endpoint, which is the actual assets, and we can filter by that location ID, which will give us those 2 devices in this case that we're looking for. It could be more than 2 in any given situation, but we know that we've got 2 in there now. And then we're going to loop through each of those entities that exist within that external system, Snipe IT, and we're going to create corresponding device records within NetBox. But we've got some sanity checking here. So we're looking at the asset tag to see if such a device already exists in NetBox. So this is just some sanity checking of the data between the 2 systems here. If it already exists in NetBox, we're not going to try and recreate it. So we do some checks to make sure that we have a corresponding device type and device role that would match the data that's coming from the external system. And then we create the actual device. Now what's interesting in this case is this is an example of, let's say, the entities that procurement is putting into Snipe IT, they don't know what the names of those devices are. They're just purchasing hardware. That's up to the networking team to come up with what the names will actually be. So we're just going to give a kind of a boilerplate name, which is based on the site name, the device role, their category from Snipe IT, and then the asset tag number. And then we can change that information later. And we can imagine, maybe down the road we can create another script which would backport the names that our networking team would put into NetBox for the proper usage of this data in the real world back into the Snipe IT system to those records that exist in there. But this is basically what we've got here. So now let's actually commit this and push it up to our repo, because we've got a CI/CD pipeline which will take this new script and put it into our production NetBox instance. So let's take a look at what we've got here. So we've got a new script, so we're going to add that. We're going to push that up to GitHub. And if we come over here, we've got a new action, and we've got a GitHub action which constitutes our CI/CD pipeline here. And it is actually going to, it's a very simple pipeline. All it's really going to do is take the content of the repo and push it to our production NetBox instance. Now, of course, you could do more complicated things like testing of the actual scripts and so forth, but in this case, we're just illustrating that we can use a CI/CD pipeline to manage the custom scripts that our teams are writing and actually get them into NetBox. So we'll see this complete in just a moment. All right. That job has completed, and if we go over here to NetBox, we don't have to do anything else at this point. We'll just go back to our scripts endpoint, and we see this new script has appeared, Snipe IT import. And remember, we had that CHS site, so we're going to select that. We want to commit these changes. We're going to go ahead and run that script. It's running. It completed. And we see that it created 2 devices here in that CHS site. And if we go to our site, CHS, we see those 2 devices now here. We created them in an inventory state. That's what our code actually did for us. And if we check the serial number and the asset tag here, those will correspond to the serial number and the asset tag for the devices that we created. So that's custom scripts in a nutshell. Obviously, you can do whatever it is that, from a business standpoint, you'd actually like to do with these, but these are just 2 examples. One where we're dealing with just data strictly in NetBox, and one where we're actually integrating NetBox with an external system. Well, I hope you found some use out of custom scripts. And I'm sure through those demos, you probably asked yourself a couple of times, well, what if I want to do something a little bit more advanced? Well, that gets into our next topic, plugins. Now, NetBox plugins offer the greatest ability to extend the core of NetBox, but with that great ability does come the requirement for a little bit more depth in traditional software engineering. And the reason for that is because the plugins framework in NetBox is based around the concept of Django apps. So this comes from native Django, and these are applications that are meant to be reusable, so they're modular in nature. And so basically we're taking this concept of Django apps and conforming them to specific NetBox interfaces which we expose from the core of NetBox. So in doing so, Plugins are able to provide to NetBox users custom models, new views, menu items, new REST API endpoints, and notably they can also extend core model templates, and I'll explain in a moment what that actually means. Now, plugins do also give the ability to define user accessible configuration, so that would be in the configuration.py file for NetBox. And the intent here is that plugin authors will be able to package and distribute their plugins via normal Python packaging constructs. So their users can do a pip install of the plugin and be off and running with it. So let's get into some hands-on with plugins now. Alright, so I'm here on a local install of NetBox, and the reason for that is because I'm working as a plugin developer to create a plugin. And the use case that I'm using here in this example is a plugin for tracking AWS resources, and specifically I've started with tracking VPCs today. Now I know I've got a plugin installed because I've got this new menu item that only appears when plugins are actually running in a NetBox environment. And I've got a section here for AWS resources. That is in fact my plugin, and I've got some stuff related to VPCs here. So if we were to click on that, we're taken to a list view here, and as you can see, this looks a lot like the rest of NetBox, and that is a core tenet, is that we are able to have plugin developers create their plugins in a way so that they conform to the look and feel of the rest of NetBox. So, I've got all the buttons that I would expect to have here, like being able to add a new VPC. We'll call this new VPC, and we'll put this maybe in the Oregon region, and we'll tie it to this particular container prefix. So we've got our object list view here, and we can see some parameters that are related to this VPC model, and we've got a link here to our container prefix. And I'll go down this rabbit hole here because what we've actually got here is a foreign key to the core NetBox prefix model. And that's important because we are able to do that as a plugin developer. We're able to link to existing models within the NetBox data model. And if you're an existing NetBox user, on this page you might have already seen this VPC section and wondered where that came from. Well, this goes back to the previous slide where I mentioned the ability to extend core NetBox templates. So in effect, what we're doing here is injecting plugin content into NetBox pages. And we can do this for most of the model detail templates within NetBox today. So this is really awesome because it gives us a way to actually augment the views that a user might have in the core of NetBox, even though a plugin doesn't have purview over those particular areas of NetBox. And in this case, it makes perfect sense because we've got a foreign key from our VPC to a given prefix. Well, it makes sense on the prefix view that we'd be able to see the VPCs that prefix is linked to. And if we follow that link back, we go back where we were just a moment ago. So very awesome ability in that case. So let's dive into the code and see exactly how we're doing this. So this is our actual plugin repo here that I've got going, and we'll start with setup.py. There's nothing special in terms of either Django or NetBox in terms of what's going on here. This is really just some metadata that allows Python to package this application so it can actually be installed in our NetBox environment. So we've got a directory here called NetBox AWS, and as you might imagine, that is in fact the name of our plugin. And if you do have prior experience with Django development, a lot of what you see here will seem familiar, and that's because most of it is just core Django. And there are some specific elements to the NetBox plugins framework that I will point out as we go through here. And I'll start with our dunder init. And we've got a thing called plugin config in here. And if you do come from a Django background, you're probably familiar with app config or application config. And plugin config is in fact just a specific type of app config, and we've just basically subclassed it so that we can add some additional parameters here. But if you're unfamiliar with all of that, it's basically just a way to expose metadata to Django about what this application is doing, in this case our NetBox plugin. We do have some additional things like required settings and default settings. So as I mentioned, you do have the ability to expose configuration parameters to your users that they can use in configuration.py. Say you've got a use case where you need the user to always specify some value for some parameters. Well, That's what you can do with required settings. You can specify those keys to make sure that NetBox will not start if the user has not properly defined those in configuration.py. And then default settings are quite self-explanatory there as well. We've also got caching configuration. So plugins are able to make use of NetBox's core ability to do caching of models, and you can manipulate that configuration for your plugin here as well. So we'll take a look at our models here, and you'll note here there's really nothing special going on. We're just using the stock model base class from Django, and we just define our model as normal. And I'll point out here that our container prefix field, this is where we've got that foreign key to the NetBox core prefix model. And I say this to point out that in the plugins framework in NetBox, we do not have the ability to manipulate or change the way that core models operate, but we can augment them in patterns very similar to this. So foreign keys or many-to-many relationships, things like that we're able to do with the plugins framework very easily. And combining this approach with the ability to do template injection, which I'll talk about in depth in just a moment, really allow us to do some powerful things within that framework. And so now we'll talk about the navigation items. So this is a NetBox specific feature of the plugins framework, and what this is we're programmatically exposing the links that we would like to show in the drop-down menu under plugins in the nav menu. And so we do that by creating these plugin menu item objects, all inside of a tuple menu item, so kind of similar to URL patterns if you come from a Django background there. So we're defining the link here, which is just the named link in the Django context. We give it the text. You can define permissions, so plugins framework does adhere to NetBox's built-in permission framework. And then buttons here, so remember we had that green plus button to be able to create a new VPC. Well, this is how we did that. We create a menu, a plugin menu button, different than an item, but a button, which defines some parameters for that button, like the color and the type of button and so forth. So it's really neat that we're able to do this in a programmatic context. And that's how we do menu items within the NetBox plugins framework. So let's talk about the template content injection. So this, again, was how on the core prefix page we were able to create a whole new section in that page that doesn't exist in the core of NetBox, but our plugin is actually defining. And so we do that by creating these plugin template extension classes, And what these do is you tie these to a particular model. So this is following the content type framework pattern here for defining the app name that it comes from in the core of NetBox, and then the model name, so ipam.prefix in this case. And then we define some methods here. And this one's called right page, and these do have to follow very specific names. So there's left page, right page, full page, and buttons are the options that we have there, are the 4 specific options that we have there. And as the name implies, we're going to inject whatever content we want in the right-hand side of the page in the prefix. And if you remember from our prefix view, we'll take a look there. We're injecting this little section here on the right-hand side of the page. If we had done left page, it would of course show up here, or full page across the full page. Buttons allow us to add additional buttons that we see here, like clone, edit, or delete. We can add additional buttons here on any of these types of pages. So what we're actually doing within these methods is you can define whatever code you want to do here, so any type of dynamic logic that you might need to do to determine whether or not you actually want to inject content on any given page could be very important. And an example I'll give you of that is my template will only show this section of the page if there is a VPC that relates to this given prefix. So for 10.00/16, there is actually a VPC assigned there. But if I go back to my full prefix list and I go to, say, this prefix, there is no VPC assigned to this prefix, and thus we don't show that page. And that was up to me as the plugin developer to decide whether or not I actually wanted to do any to do that. You could have it always render some content, or you could do this conditional type of rendering. It's up to you. And if we look at the actual template here, what we're actually doing is just rendering this template here. And you do have the ability to pass in additional context parameters like you would when you do normal types of rendering in Django. But if we go and look at that prefix right template, this is how I'm doing the determination of whether or not I want to actually inject any content. As I've just wrapped the entire template in a simple if statement here to see if the set of VPCs for this given prefix, which is called object in this case to keep things generic, but this is the prefix object as we're rendering that prefix page. Whether or not the count of VPCs assigned to that prefix is greater than 0, then we'll render the actual page. And in this case, we just loop over all of the entities within that VPC set list and template out the name of the VPC with a link to it and then the region that it's associated with. So it's just that simple to do that kind of thing. And of course, in our templates directory is where we had our other templates, but that is just normal Django there, so nothing special to go about there. Now, our plugins do have the ability to expose REST API, as I mentioned, and core NetBox uses the Django REST framework. And so we follow some constructs here, like having all of our API implementation contained in an API directory. So that is a construct that we're looking for in the plugins framework to be able to dynamically load this code and be able to execute it. And so specifically, we're looking for your urls.py file, which is going to load your router configuration and expose the URL patterns. And so our views from that point on are really quite normal. There's nothing specific to NetBox going on in here. It's up to you as the plugin developer to decide what you want those to do. Now, namespacing for this API is important. You may have noticed, we'll hop back over here, that when we're dealing with our plugins, all of our URLs have this prefix of plugins. So that keeps things namespaced to make sure you don't accidentally have any namespace collisions with the core of NetBox and so forth. The API is done very much in a similar way. So if we go to /API, we have a plugin section, and we'll talk about this install plugins endpoint here in a moment, but because my plugin has exposed an API urls.py file with valid URL pattern entries in it, we go ahead and include those in our API representation here. And we can follow these links through, and I've exposed VPC's list route here, and we can see that data is actually populated. So very cool, very nice ability to do that. So if we back up just a moment and we go back to plugins, we can look at this install plugins. This will always be here, regardless of whether or not you have any plugins that are actually exposing APIs. And this is a really nice ability for you as a NetBox user to see what plugins are actually installed. And we do actually have that exposed in one other way, is if we go into the admin portion of our NetBox instance, down here at the very bottom, there's an install plugins section. And this will just list all of the plugins that we have installed here, all of the metadata associated with those. And that is at least a high-level overview of plugins. And I do wish that we had much more time in this session to go much deeper into things. But I will leave you with some resources here. So links to both of today's repos for custom scripts and plugins. All of the code that you saw me go over today is available in those repos. And also some links to documentation, so to the NetBox general documentation, and then specifically to the links specifically for custom scripts and plugin development. And then also in the community section here, link to the NetBox repo on GitHub, and then also the Network to Code Slack. And there you'll find the NetBox channel with tons of NetBox users that you can chat in real time, as well as several of the maintainers, like myself and Jeremy Stretch, and several others are also on that Slack. And also we do have a Google Groups discussion group. And the last point that I'll leave you with today is that Network to Code does have extensive knowledge and expertise in NetBox, so we would love to chat with you about any needs that you might have with custom scripts and plugins. So with that, I do thank you for your time, and I wish you the best of luck with all of your NetBox development.